Right, so I'm going to be talking about research we have conducted over the past year and a half on earthquakes, emotions and actions. I guess that this is familiar to most of you. We have a big problem in Groningen. There are an increasing number of earthquakes. There is also an increasing intensity of earthquakes. And the thing to note here is that the scale is logarithmic. So the problem is increasing fast. And what's more, if we look at projections, how this will end up in the future, the problem will not cease or end anytime soon. It's going to continue. Now, to add to this, there is a culprit. This is not Mother Nature doing this to us. This is Mother Nature through an agent. And the agent is the government and a company, the NAM. A recent report has very clearly blamed these parties for not taking care of us, the inhabitants of Groningen. Shamefully so, according to many, including politicians. And the underlying reason would be that there is a structural neglect of safety because people are focused on economic gain exclusively too much. Increasingly, this is causing the realization that not only is there a right for people here in Groningen to have a grievance, but also there is a culprit. There's somebody who's culpable. So opinion leaders like Joep have started exclaiming in the national media that of course these Groningers should not stand by and let this happen. They should simply rise up in arms. And this issue of simply rising up in arms sounds as if it's eminently doable under the circumstances. But does it happen? Well, there are some examples that yes, quite a lot is happening. So about a year ago, this website was launched and it promised that Groningers would rise up in arms. 25,000 likes, which is quite a lot if you consider that the population size isn't all that large. About a year ago, Kamp visited Loppersum and there was a brief moment where it looked like that the Bastille would be stormed again. For a very brief moment, Kamp had to fear for his life. It took about 2 seconds. And we've had various protests. It hasn't been quiet, but many people seem to have expected a lot more. Now, on the basis of past research, we know that there are quite a few factors that can predict whether people are willing and able to rise up. So this is a meta-analysis we published a few years back, and we looked at 3 well-known predictors. Shared identity, the feeling that we have to do something. Moral emotions, a sense of outrage, a grievance. We have been wronged. Something is not happening that's not right. And a sense of efficacy. If we do something now, if we give the government a push, if we go and blockade this or that, things can happen. Things can change. Now, on the basis of our research during the past year, we have examined all these factors, and what we can say is yes, there is outrage. Quite a bit of it. People are angry, or to be more precise, there is a rather large segment of the population who are extremely angry. There are enough people who have anger. There are also a lot of people who are not angry, but who experience different emotions. There is also a feeling that the government and the NAM are to blame. That doesn't necessarily translate into a shared identity that we are angry, so we'll see later on, but it's very clear that they have wronged us. It's a very strong perception there. But the problem, you might say, or one of the things that prevents a concerted form of action from arising, is that not everybody agrees that change is possible. In fact, a year ago when we did our research, most people tended to think that change was impossible, that whatever people here in Groningen would do, the bonanza would continue. So if you ask this often heard question, why are there not more actions? These are some of the factors that might play a role. Sense of efficacy might not be strong enough. But in recent research, we pointed out that there are other factors which also need to be in place. This is a report we wrote for the Ministry of Security and Justice, and we complicated this notion that people have one of 2 choices. Either you can act or you can remain passive. Now, if we look at what people are reporting in Groningen, what we actually see That if you ask people, what is it that you can do? What is it you want to do? People come up with many more options, many more choices. And a lot of these aren't necessarily visible. So yes, vast numbers of people mention things related to action, pushing others in a particular kind of direction, blockading things, demonstrating. But many people also simply want to express their solidarity or support, or they want to voice their discontent. And these are not necessarily actions that are visible or recognized in the same kind of way. So it appears that people are pulling in slightly different directions. Some people are only interested in political actions, and others, interestingly, merely interested to inform others, tell them about it as soon as they realize things will change. There are also people who chose to be inactive, or who think that they must be inactive because there's simply nothing they can do. Now, interestingly, the feeling that you can do little is often voiced at the same time as saying, I want my voice to be heard. So there's a nice paradox there. It appears that inaction, involuntary inaction, and decisions to protest and to make your voice heard are not contradictory to people. They can be both passive and active at the same time. What doesn't co-occur is these two. People who have the intention to wait or ignore the problem, who say, well, it's best if we don't pay any attention to it. Now, very rare are these forms of action, but they do occur. And they're quite interesting. I think self-focused action we all recognize, and these are people who are trying to somehow lead a normal life. They say, well, I want to stay positive, I want to keep calm, I want to inform myself, think along, try and come up with good solutions for the people here. Or people who just say, I want to move, I want to leave Groningen. It's extremely rare, but it does occur. And thinking about it, some people might say, well, given the circumstances, isn't this the only rational thing to do? So there are mixed messages here. There are a multitude of actions. They appear at first blush to be contradictory, but in some weird way, they are not contradictory to our respondents. But the overriding picture is that there are rather many things that people think they want to do, need to do, and can do. The second complicating factor is that you have to ask yourself, there's another report where we pointed this out, you have to ask yourself, well, what are the means that are available, right? Because psychologically, all these factors can be in place, but you need other things as well. You need resources, you need opportunity. There must be catalysts in the environment which bring people to the street, which make things happen. Now let's examine this for Groningen. Resources? Well, yes, there are protest organizations, and some of them have some members, but there are rather many. And they don't all seem to be pulling in the same direction all the time. And what's more, does this action infrastructure represent a stable institution that has existed for a long time, that knows how to mobilize people, like a trades union, that has a lot of practice, a lot of experience? No, none of these organizations do. None of the leaders really have a lot of experience with collective action. So everything has to be invented from the ground up. This is a complex task, and it'll take time. So in 2014, when we did the research, well, it was pretty dire. There wasn't a lot of infrastructure available. You also need people with political awareness and the means, people like us who need to say this is scandalous, people who, like us, who are willing to throw a brick if the situation calls for it, or to organize a blockade, or to write a petition. Are those people available? Well, not really. In 2014, it was a very mixed picture, and a rather large segment of the population didn't really like action that was visible or audible. So they preferred other kinds of means. Secondly, there must be opportunities, there must be targets, there must be events. It would help a lot if Minister Kamp was in Groningen regularly, in a place where we know that he's going to be. In 2014 in Loppersum, that was the case. Everybody knew where he was. There was a press conference. It was a particular kind of location. And lo and behold, at that event, people started storming that location. It looked impressive for a brief moment. Oh, yes. Well, otherwise, however, there is very little around. There's little you can do. Numb locations, there's no persons around. Not a lot of opportunities available. And catalysts, well, in 2014 there wasn't really that much media attention yet, and also there were no opinion leaders who said it is legitimate to take action. 2015, the situation seems to have changed a little bit. Some improvements here and there. And finally, is there a critical mass? Well, we need to do a lot of work in order to ensure that we have the same emotions, in order to ensure that the identity that we share is indeed ours and not just mine. And if you look at the consensus that existed in 2014, people agreed who was the perpetrator, people agreed who was the guilty party, but they didn't necessarily agree what was the crime. They certainly didn't agree who was the victim. Right? So there's a big discrepancy within Groningen, for example, between the residents of the city and the residents of the countryside. And even on the countryside, things are much more divided than you'd think. And finally, there is no consensus about what actions are available, are legitimate. And also that is changing gradually. So what are the conclusions? Well, there appears to be very limited collective action in Groningen, but I think it's partially because we're looking in the wrong places for it. So the problem is not that there isn't any action. The problem is perhaps that there are too many small actions, too many small organizations, and too many voices who are saying slightly different things. Certainly you can point to the absence of large theatrical actions, flashpoints, big events happening. I also want to point to this critical mass issue. So we need a critical mass of people in order to sustain collective action. Is that there in Groningen? Well, there is if you look at the causes and also now the solution. So everybody basically agrees that gas extraction has to diminish very rapidly, and a lot more than it has now. But what is not there yet is consensus about who we are, who is affected here. Is it de Groninger? Is it all of us? Or is it just the people who live in Weerdum and Loppersum? We don't agree about our goals either. So what are the objectives? Who should we push? Do we need to kick the NAM out, for example? Those kinds of things, there is no consensus out. And there's also no real consensus yet about the methods, although increasingly people are open to actively protest. Thanks.